Hello and welcome to the Practical Coder channel. In this video, we will talk about scope in JavaScript. Let's dive right in. What is scope? Scope is the part of the program that contains a valid binding between variable and value. In other words, it's basically a mechanism that allows a program in JavaScript or other programming languages to access your variables inside your program. So think of this as a container that specifies which program or which method can access your variables at what time during the execution of your program. Let's have a look at an example on the right side. As you can see, we have a variable called name, John Doe, and that is at the top level where we have the JavaScript engine, running this program. This would basically be a global variable. In other words, the name would be available in the global scope of JavaScript. And in the orange box where you see variable age equals 20, we are basically creating, it could be a different program, it could be a different module in JavaScript, but in this case, that would become its own scope. So then the orange basically area or the orange container will include another variable that is called age. Now, in this case, this orange, so any code that you write in the orange container will have access to the variables defined in the upper containers or in the outer containers. So in this case, you got name that you can access in the orange container or scope, but you can't access the variables defined in these lower scopes or containers in your global environment or scope. And the pink container at the end, this could be a different module, for example. That variable then has its own scope. It can be a bit confusing, but once we look at a couple of examples, you'll understand what scope really is and how it can be used in JavaScript. In general, there are two types of scope in JavaScript: lexical scope and execution context, or in-memory scope. The lexical scope is very straightforward. So what this does is basically refer to the area or the scope in your code that can refer to a variable by name without getting any access errors. So you can identify this type of scope without running your code, because the way you identify lexical scope is by looking at the code and understanding where in your code the scope of that particular variable exists. So if you have multiple functions in your code, you might have multiple variables. Variables outside of the function have their own scope, and variables inside of your function, the ones that you declare inside your functions, would have their own scope. Lexical scope is bound to region in the code, right? So again, it's basically looking at the code where curly braces start and curly braces end, and they basically define the lexical scope in JavaScript. And so just like before, in the previous bullet point, the scope is built as you type. So there's really no need for the program to be executed in order to understand the scope of the variable. Basically, as you type, you can tell where the program can access your variables, for example. And then we have the execution context. This can be a bit confusing, but stay with me. We will go through some examples and hopefully you'll be able to understand this easily. So when a program runs, computer allocates memory to hold variables and their values. These in-memory data structures are called execution contexts. So unlike lexical scope, that can be identified by just looking at the lines of code and where your blocks of code, the curly braces start and end. This one is slightly different. This one can be identified only when you run your program, only when JavaScript engine executes your program. That's where the scope comes into play, execution context comes to play. In-memory scope or execution context is bound to, in-memory scope is bound to execution context. In other words, this type of scope can only be identified and used in execution context. And this scope is built as the code runs. Unlike lexical scope, the scope is built as you type your code, but in this case, this scope is built as JavaScript runs your program. So an example of this would be whenever your function is called, or you have multiple functions in your code, a new execution context is created every time. So your functions may or may not have variables, depending on how you write your code, but every time that function runs, a new context is created. So it may have its own variables. It will have access to the JavaScript engine's environment, so that would be a global scope. It may have access to this keyword in JavaScript, and we'll come to this in a minute to look at a couple of examples. So lexical scope, as we described, it's basically identified by looking at the code and saying where your code uses variables. So on the left here, you see we got a global scope. So in this case, app.js, is the main container application that includes all of your other files or JavaScript code. In this case, I have declared a variable called app name in inventory manager. So your app name can be accessed throughout the entire program because it is declared in the global scope. And then within this, let's say we have another file called product.js that you have imported into app.js. This will, have its own scope because it's a separate container. You got a new variable called SKU, for example, so you can access in it, you can access app name variable. You won't get any access errors. And the same applies to the warehouse.js file, for example. You can declare a new variable called location. In this case, if you were to try to access SKU, you can't because that lives in a separate file or scope, lexical scope or region of your code. However, in warehouse.js, you can access app_name that exists in the global scope. You won't run into any access errors. And so below the two orange blocks, we got console.log app name. It will definitely work. However, if you are doing console.log location, you can't access it because it is not in the global scope. Another way to look at this is understand where your curly braces start and end. So basically which blocks use which variables, and that would identify or help you identify scope. So app name, like the top level container, that is global variable, so it exists in the global scope. Within this, we have this scope or the function called create warehouse that has another variable location, for example. So location is bound to this specific block, or the scope of location is within create warehouse function. And so then within it, we have another function, for example, called name, and the name can access location because it is in the same lexical scope. And within it, we can access the global scope as well. So that means anything defined in the kind of pink box outside of the create warehouse function. And I have posted a link here that you can find in the description as well, basically kind of showing you the same thing in action without, so we'll see where, if we are trying to access a variable that's not in the lexical scope, we'll get an access error. However, if there's global variables, they can be accessed anywhere in your program. We won't be running into any errors. So let's run this code. As you can see, we got reference error, location is not defined. And so looking at that here on line 14, this is because location is within the create warehouse function scope. So in this area, in this region, it belongs to this scope. We can't really access it outside of it. But if we were to access it within another function that stays within that scope or region, you can certainly access it. So if I comment this out and run the code, we should be good to go. Let's go back to our slides. The second one that is a bit confusing is execution context or in-memory scope. So basically, this comes into play once you start executing your program. Remember, lexical scope was easy to understand and identify because you were looking at the code just by identifying like which line in your file that variable is declared. You can basically look at that and tell whether it is within scope or outside the scope. Execution context is a bit different. Execution context is basically a wrapper around your code that contains code generated by the JavaScript engine. So once you hit that run button, for example, when you run your JavaScript snippet or code, JavaScript does its magic. JavaScript engine kind of takes that code, adds its own variables and scope, and then runs the code for you, right? So what does the execution context give us then? It gives us the global object. So depending on what JavaScript engine you're running, which environment you're running, if you're in Node, you'll have access to the global object. If you are inside a browser, you have access to the window object, which is basically the global object in browsers. And so you also have access to the this keyword, depending on where your code is being executed. And then you have environment outside your program or code. So you'll have access to things like IO and some other libraries that probably have access to something else on your machine or on the server, for example, or in the browser. And then, of course, you have access to your code as well. So think of this execution context as that kind of dynamic environment where scope kind of changes. Scope is built as your program runs. A new scope or container is built for like every function that gets executed. But in lexical scope, that was the easiest concept. That is basically like how you structure your code. Based on that, you can tell where you'll have access to your variables and where you won't. Execution context in practice, I wanted to show you this amazing website from UI.dev. They, made this amazing JavaScript visualizer that gives us an idea as how our code, as the code runs, how the execution context is built. So on the left side, I have this simple JavaScript code. We are declaring a global variable called John Doe. Within this, then we have another global variable or function called say hello, and within it we have another variable greeting, and then within it we have show greeting method function, and that gets executed on line 8, and then finally the say hello function gets called or executed on line 11. On the right, this is basically a visualization of what the context looks like. So we'll play with this in a minute, but I want you to look at the blocks on the right side and just kind of understand that there are 3 different kind of scopes or containers, right? One is the yellow one, the global execution context. So the moment we run our code, a global execution context is immediately created by JavaScript, right? So since this was ran in a browser, we have access to the main global object, which is window. We have access to this, basically refers to the window object. And then a name, John Doe variable is declared because that lives in the global context. And then we have a function called say hello, right? So that gets declared as well. So we have access to it in this yellow box, the global container. And then you got this pink area. The pink area is basically, it's called anonymous execution context. It doesn't have a name, but that doesn't matter. What you need to know is that now, as the program steps through the lines of your code and executes it, we, depending on whether it's a new function or is simply just declaring a new or initializing a new variable, new context might be created, right? So JavaScript in this case creates a new execution context when we execute the function say hello. So in that case, what we have is access to this object, of course, and then we have access to hello John Doe, and that happens because on line 4 we created a new variable greeting hello plus name. So we have access to name and we have access to the greeting variable directly here because it is within this execution context. And then we also declared a new function called show greeting. Now on line 8 you would see that we are calling show greeting function. So as soon as that line gets executed by JavaScript engine, in this case the browser, it creates a new context. So in this case it has access to this object window because that is global, and then we haven't declared created a new variable inside it. That's why we don't see other variables. But also keep one thing in mind, that the context, the blue context, that execution context, has access to its parent context or container, and then that one has access to its parent as well. So as you can see, every time function gets called, it has its own execution context. Within it, we have access to certain areas in your program. Okay, I hope this video was helpful. I hope now you can tell the difference between lexical and lexical scope and execution context in JavaScript. There is a lot of resources out there. Feel free to reach out, comment on the video, ask your questions. I'll be happy to answer them. And if you have time, play with this visualization tool, ui.dev/JavaScript visualizer. It's an amazing tool. It shows you a tree map in real time of your code on the left side as you run it, and it would kind of build this tree map for you. Yep, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Just post them in the video comments, and see you in the next video.